Welcome to the politicalbetting.com Polling Matters show. My name is Kieran Pedley. Well, should we stay or should we go? That's the question on everyone's lips with more than 1 week to go until the EU Referendum campaign. But a couple of weeks ago it looked like Remain was on course for victory. But the polls have significantly narrowed to the point now where no one can be quite sure what the result will be. So we'll be looking today at what the polls say, what the punters are saying at the betting shops, and also what we think will happen next week and what's behind the sudden contraction in the polls. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel, Professor Matthew Goodwin from the University of Kent. Matthew. Adam Ludlow from Senior Consultant at Comres. And welcome back to the show, Matthew Shattuck of Ladbrokes.
Kieran.
So, lots to talk about. Obviously, people are very interested in what's going on. I'll come to you first, Adam. I mean, you've had a poll out last night, which showed a race that is significantly narrowing, didn't it?
Absolutely. So our telephone polling had been showing relatively healthy Remain leads for some time, right up sort of in the high teens throughout the end of last year. We saw a little bit of narrowing sort of around the period of the renegotiation when sort of David Cameron and Donald Tusk stood on the steps of Downing Street and was saying we've secured major change to the European settlement, and the public basically looked at him and said, no, Dave, you haven't. But then following sort of, the Obama visit and sort of number of economic warnings, that had really grown, the Remain lead had really grown to sort of as well, sort of 11 points and 15 points there. But our most recent poll last night has shown the Remain lead shrinking considerably from 11 points down to 1, and with a week to go, it's basically on a knife edge.
And I found this particularly astonishing because, I mean, those people that watch this show, listen to this show, will know that there's been this big difference between telephone and online polls in the recent past. So I suppose that it stood to reason that a telephone poll such as yours would be the most favourable for Remain, or it certainly seemed to be that way. I mean, what's behind this sudden sort of contraction? I mean, we can talk about the issues in a moment, but who are the people that are changing their minds?
So we've tended to see, when we were sort of polling back in sort of 2015, we tend to see basically the only people who were more likely to support leaving the European Union than remaining were the least affluent and the very oldest. And basically what we've seen gradually over time is no longer is just 65 pluses who are most likely to leave. That gradually came down to 55 pluses. I think in our last couple of polls, sort of even 45 to 54-year-olds are sort of a little bit on the edge, and then in our latest poll, right down to sort of anybody aged 45 plus, sort of quite large leads now for leaving the European Union. Equally, whereas it used to be just DE voters, the DE social grades, the C2s have massively swung in favour of leaving, and even it's pretty much narrowed down to a sort of a neck-and-neck race amongst C1s as well, leaving just those most affluent AB voters more likely to remain.
And we'll come to some of the reasons why a bit later, but I know that the polling wonks that sort of listen to this show will know that you guys have your own kind of turnout model, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the ways you've reacted to the polling miss last year. I mean, what sort of impact does that have on a race like this? Because I guess it stands to reason that turnout's quite difficult to really understand in a referendum situation. But from a polling perspective, what is that turnout model that you've got doing to the numbers? Like, for example, if you hadn't have done it, where would this be?
So without the turnout model, that would have been neck and neck last night. Generally, we've tended to see the model cancel each other out. It uses two key demographics in particular, which is age and social grade affluence. And basically, in the European Union referendum, the affluent voters who are very likely to vote are splitting for Remain, and the older voters who are more likely to split for Leave but turn out in large numbers are on the other side. So they're sort of cancelling each other out. We think social grade is actually a slightly stronger predictor of whether you vote or not, which is why it gives a very slight advantage to Remain, but broadly they're sort of balancing each other out.
I'll bring in Matt Shattuck from Ladbrokes here. I mean, presumably, Matt, with the tightening in the polls, you've seen that reflected in the odds as well, and the money.
Yeah, in a big way. And in fact, the change actually seemed to happen a little bit before the polls started moving. Now, I'm not saying the betting markets were super prescient. It may have been a coincidence, but I guess about the start of May, the betting was suggesting there was about 82% chance that Remain would win. And now we're at a stage where we think it's more like 60-40. And even
we've got the odds about to come up actually here. So for the benefit of people listening, at the moment, or at least at the time I put this chart together, 64 Leave, I think, and 8 to 15 for Remain. So you were saying about the percentages
Yeah, I mean, so even at the start of this week, we gave Leave a 25% chance, or at least that's what the odds implied. And now we're up to 38. In fact, it hit about 42 yesterday. So a huge swing just generated by the weight of money we're seeing on the Leave side.
And one of the things that people always ask me about betting is, what's driving these odds? I mean, is it purely what people are putting money on, or are you making a subjective judgment as well based on other things?
Yeah, I mean, there's some subjective input into this, but it's mostly just supply and demand situation. More money goes on Leave, the odds come down, and vice versa. Within a very narrow range, we can change that a little bit, but it's less to do with our opinion on what the result's going to be, because quite frankly, I've given up trying to work out what the result's going to be. It's more to do with how we think our customers are going to react in the last week of the campaign, what odds they want to take, and where we want to position ourselves versus the rest of the betting market. That's more what I'm thinking about now, rather than trying to second guess what's going to happen on next Thursday.
Let's open it up to a bit more of a discussion. Matthew Goodwin, I'll bring you in now. I mean, Adam painted a very clear picture, which is reflected in all the polls there, of a tightening race. Why do you think it's tightened so quickly? I mean, surely these issues like immigration were always there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different theories that we're never really going to be able to answer until we've got some good pre and post referendum data. I mean, one theory simply is that what we're picking up in the polls, we've had now 11 polls recently, 8 of those have put Leave ahead. That does coincide with their strategic shift, which is a lot more emphasis on immigration, for example, and all the research that we've got shows that immigration is the big driver of the Leave vote. Perhaps another alternative theory is that we are just seeing a reflection of the weakness of the Remain camp, that the Remain camp has really struggled to connect and deliver a resonant message, and that voters have been turned off by the scaremongering, by the elite focus. But perhaps a third sort of provocative theory is that perhaps none of this is actually happening at all, and perhaps all of this is just sort of random noise, and we still have some underlying problems with the data. Now, I obviously don't necessarily endorse that third view, because it's now being shown across online and phone polls. There could be some herding going on. I don't know perhaps if others have thoughts about that, but we are sort of seeing this general convergence, and we're not going to be able to explain it until after the referendum.
But I guess the trouble is, when it's so close, there is a danger that some pollsters will be 51-49 one way, some will be 51-49 the other, and it's going to produce winners and losers.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't think overall the polling industry has still got some challenges to resolve. I think this referendum campaign has thrown some light on those. But it's going to be, it's also a challenge as well, not just for pollsters, for academic forecasts too. I mean, if you looked at the latest elections, etc. update this morning, the probability of a Remain win now has gone from 84% down to 51%. So there's a lot of academic analysis on the line here as well. We've had a survey of almost 600 academics and think tankers, and 95%, I believe, of those have predicted a Remain win. So I mean, this could be embarrassing for everybody.
I want to go back to that. I'll get Adam's view on the herding point in a moment, but I'll give him time to think about that. But before we do, let's go back to the issues and some of the supplementary questions that you were asking in your poll this week. I found one particularly really striking. There was a question around immigration and the economy, and I guess what I really like about the way you've done these questions, actually, as you're here, is the fact that it's not just sort of agree, disagree. It's actually trying to give people a choice. And I suppose in a campaign like this, which is so binary, that's really what people are going to be doing. They're going to be choosing between things. So I'm going to read these out for the benefit of people that might be listening rather than watching. So there was 2 options that people were given. I am more worried what will happen to the economy if the UK leaves the EU, or they were given the option of I am more worried about the number of EU migrants coming to the UK. And it was pretty evenly split. 49% said more worried about what happens to the economy if we leave. 47% said I'm more worried about the number of migrants, and 5% said don't know. But for me, and there was also a question around sort of positives or negatives of the EU, and that was pretty evenly split as well, which I guess reflects a sort of narrow race. But the one that stood out for me was this choice. I would accept a short-term economic slowdown in order to tighten controls on immigration. 61% back to that answer, as opposed to the 35% that said I would not accept a short-term economic slowdown in order to tighten controls on immigration. That suggests to me, I mean, if you take that one finding in isolation, that this economic versus immigration argument is going to be won by the Leave side. I mean, what's your sort of take on some of these campaigns?
Well, very, very interesting. Certainly there seems to be a demand for immigration to be reduced and for somebody to pay for it, even if that causes a short-term economic slowdown on a macro scale. What's quite interesting is that we also run a supplementary question when we ask people individually, how much would you pay out of your personal income to reduce the amount of immigration from EU countries into the UK? And 2/3 of people said nothing. So although people sort of appreciate that, so they want immigration.
So I'll take
reduced.
repercussions, but someone else could pay for it.
Yes, exactly. So quite sort of the disconnect between the micro and the macro sort of scenarios, I think is probably it will probably determine part of the outcome, whether people are thinking about themselves personally or sort of more general picture.
Just quickly come in there because there is a very fascinating difference between the Scottish referendum and this referendum, which Lawrence Yantala-Pinsky has pointed out at YouGov, which is that if you look at the Scottish referendum, perceived economic damage at the individual level was a really big driver of that late shift over against independence, and people felt that independence wasn't going to work out for them and their families. And Lawrence has pointed out that that does not apply to the same extent as at this referendum, that economic self-interest at the individual level is not as powerful as it was in Scotland. Now, my reading of that, which others may disagree with, is actually this is consistent with what we're seeing on the board, right? Which is that people are less convinced that Brexit is perhaps going to damage them personally, basically agree with the argument that it's going to affect the national economy, but that opens a door to this immigration concern, that if they feel that they can really obtain dramatic reductions in immigration, they may prioritise that over the economy.
Just to come in very quickly there, I think there is obviously that sort of where does the personal come into play, where does the sort of macroeconomic picture come into play? Because although that was the case in Scotland, we equally found the opposite at the general election when sort of Ed Miliband was equal with David Cameron on what you think is going to be best for your own personal finances. But obviously the Conservatives had absolutely untouchable leads on the general economy. I think what really is driving the difference between immigration and the economy is expectation. I think one of the key findings from our poll last night was that people think that it's more likely that Turkey will join the EU in the next decade than think it's likely that the UK will go into recession if we leave.
Yeah.
So in terms of the expectation, if you're trying to play the fear card, actually it's resonating more, the immigration line is resonating more because people think it's more likely than the risk of an economic downturn.
And I absolutely agree with that. Just very briefly, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see the new Stronger In television broadcast, but this really speaks to that point. Not a single politician in the broadcast, which on one level, great, right? They're taking politics out of it. On the other level, they don't mention immigration once, because on that Turkey issue and on that Serbia, Albania free movement issue, it's almost as if the Remain camp has sort of shut up shop.
The interesting thing, I think, is that there's mixed messages coming out of the Labour Party as well in the last couple of days. I mean, on the one hand, we've got some people in the Labour Party saying there should be controls, whatever that means, on immigration. Maybe it's another mug. And then on the other hand, you've got Jeremy Corbyn who's saying, no, actually free movement's fine. You'd almost, a cynic, Matt, would say Jeremy Corbyn would quite like to leave anyway, so maybe he's not being particularly helpful. What's your take on some of these issues? Not from a betting perspective, but your own opinion.
I mean, it's very difficult. You were mentioning off camera before, Kieran, that all of us. Well, take me for instance. I live in Southwark, right? Very likely to be a very pro-Remain area, where the effects of immigration are largely seen as very positive. All the posters in the windows nearby me are for people who want to remain, and it's really difficult for people like me and other commentators and people who are much more expert than I am, even those people, to kind of get into a mindset which isn't the kind of London pro-Remain mindset, which I guess might be driving some of the broadcasts that Matt was talking about. And it must be the case that this is having an effect. It can't be I doubt it's a coincidence that the Leave campaign's extra emphasis on immigration has coincided with their rise in the polls.
I mean, Adam, it seems like that there's a real trust issue with a lot of the politicians here, doesn't there? I mean, it almost feels like you bring in an expert to say the economy will struggle, and people sort of go, experts, what do they know? But it's a serious point there, isn't there, that there's just almost like this Project Fear doesn't seem to be working, I mean, as Matt said earlier, in this campaign as it did in Scotland.
I think there's an interesting case about the timing of the referendum in that, completely historically atypically for Britain. We've had a major referendum one year, followed by a general election the next, followed by a referendum the next year. That's an awful lot of elections going on, each one trying to deploy a fear message. No data to prove it, but whether people are slightly getting sensitised to it.
Yeah.
The Leave campaign may have done quite a good job at sort of setting that expectation early. You're going to get Project Fear, you're going to get Project Fear, you're going to get Project Fear. And it worked for a while when Obama came over. You know, we saw those sort of big spikes in the Remain lead. Well, they just seem to be out of ammo now, because every time they sort of make a threat, sort of it doesn't seem to be resonating as much as the last one. And, well, I suppose we're seeing whether we're going to be testing the strategy. If threatening doesn't work, does threatening louder?
Yeah, I mean, isn't the case here, though, that part of this is not actually supposed to turn up in the polls right now? It's supposed to turn up is when people get into the ballot box, and these kind of undecided, wavering voters, that's when, you know, historically, these kind of referenda are often won by the status quo side right at the last minute on polling day, when people actually have to make their mind up, and so maybe it wouldn't necessarily show up in polls 8 days beforehand. Perhaps they're quite confident this will still work.
Yeah, but let's look ahead to what might happen. So, I mean, obviously, if we take the view that it's a very close race, and we're going to assume that it is, whichever side's winning, and you know, to what extent is anybody really winning, you know, a week before anyway. You know, Matt, I'll bring you back in here, Matthew Goodwin. We were looking at some maps earlier about, you know, where the sort of Leave and Remain events are, and you know, bear in mind some people are listening in. Be interested to get your views on kind of where the key battleground areas might be, or even areas of strength for each side.
Yeah, so just a brief word about what we've been doing here. We've just been collecting data on publicly listed events from the Stronger In website, from Vote Leave, you know, and there is going to be, you know, there are going to be a number of events that are perhaps locally done by your mate down the pub that perhaps we haven't taken account of. But these are publicly listed events, okay? And the interesting thing, a couple of interesting things about the data here. Firstly, London is getting more than its fair share of events. We find that almost 30% of events are held in London. Well, you might expect that perhaps. It's where media and politics collide. For Remain, a big focus on the southwest. I found it quite funny when we saw David Cameron in Exeter really appealing to voters in the southwest, because less than 12 months ago he was out destroying the Liberal Democrat vote in the southwest, right? But Remain are clearly focusing on densely populated pro-EU younger cities, your Brightons, your Oxfords, your Cambridge, Nottingham, Manchester, London. And, you know, Remain campaigners are very open, I think, about that. Leave, on the other hand, spending a lot more time down the east coast of England, really tapping up those UKIP heartlands, places like Lincolnshire, Essex, Norfolk, Sussex down on the south coast, also really outgunning Remain in the East Midlands. And the East Midlands and the West Midlands, I mean, historically, are some of the most Eurosceptic areas of the country. So I actually think...
Quite Labour areas as well in many
Quite
cases.
Labour areas. And this is the interesting thing. There are going to be a lot of Labour seats that are going to deliver a majority Brexit vote. Places like Ed Miliband's constituency of Doncaster North, Yvette Cooper's constituency of Normanton, Pontefract and, I can't remember the, Castleford. And places like Barnsley East into those Yorkshire Labour heartlands. So Labour is going to have a shock. Some Labour MPs will have a shock. But all of this really matters, I think, for getting out the vote, because the campaigns have to connect with the guys you're surveying and basically convince them to get out of the armchairs, get into the polling station. And if the race is close, that could make a difference.
I wonder, Adam, that's a major challenge as your sort of turnout model sort of acknowledges, really, isn't it? Is it how does a poll capture a hypothetical sort of turnout in the future, particularly in such an unprecedented event? I suppose, I mean, you think pollsters might need to be more, I don't know if honest is the right word, but more kind of open about the fact that turnout really could influence whether a survey a week before an election actually reflects anything, because, you know, ultimately you've got a survey yesterday, scientifically done, but ultimately if you find that Scots turn out to a much greater extent than people in the East Midlands, than they say in an opinion poll, we've got a problem, haven't we?
Well, yes.
Yes.
I think you can sort of do certain things to control for that, though, because certain turnout trends broadly follow between different sorts of elections, whether that be local elections, mayoral elections, general elections. That yes, older people are more likely to vote, and particularly the more affluent you are, the more likely you are to vote, and that's a trend that's been just continuing. I think in terms of yes, so we're basically suggesting that those historical turnout patterns will continue. Now we need to be honest and say that that's an assumption we make.
I suppose that's why the Remain side are focusing so much on the groups that they need to get to turnout.
So what is your estimated
Well, I
overall
wouldn't.
turnout
We
level?
would actually suggest probably staying way away from trying to predict turnout
Yeah.
off of a poll.
Yeah.
It's one of the most difficult things to get right. Also, what we saw in London was where the number of people voting went up a little bit, but
Yeah.
recorded turnout absolutely jumped because you had fewer people on the registers. So due to individual voter registration.
Yeah.
So you can have effects there where we might see sort of equivalent number of people turning out as the general election last year, but a recorded turnout very different because you've got different number of people on the register, and sort of quite how deep the registers go is obviously a question that we don't have the answer to.
I want to move ahead to sort of what we think is going to happen and be important in the last week. But before I do, going back to this turnout point in different areas, I think we've got some more betting, Matt, on sort of where we think the strongest Remain and the strongest Leave vote will be. So the favourite for the strongest Leave area is the Isle of Wight at 3-1, followed by Peterborough 5-1, Stoke-on-Trent 5-1, and then there's a host of others, which I'm sure we'll tweet out later, that are sort of at 10s and 12s. On the other hand, with Remain, Edinburgh 5-2, and then a host of 5-1s, Cambridge, Oxford, Hackney, Southwark. I mean, is this something that people bet on a lot? I mean, I guess you've got your savvy punters trying to find the bargain.
That's the problem, because the kind of people who bet on this are the savviest, cleverest people. So I don't expect to make much money on this. But having said that, I mean, just to be clear, this isn't the top Leave or top area, Remain area in the entire country. We've just picked a few of the more interesting ones, because I guess the top Remain area might actually be some county in Northern Ireland or something like that.
So it's the top of these, is it?
Yeah, just the top of the ones we've listed here.
Okay, fine.
Because otherwise, in the Leave area, we'd have a lot of Essex council areas that maybe not many people have ever heard of. So we picked out a few bigger places, more interesting places. The Remain areas, I guess not unexpected, Scotland, London, Brighton and so on. These actually are very close to the areas which, if you go back to the AV votes back in 2011, these were the kind of places, the very few places that voted for a change. And based on some demographic data and how well UKIP have done, you can have a guess at the kind of places that Leave is likely to do best in. And as Matt said, a lot of, the kind of places that will be, in some cases, very interesting swing constituencies, some Labour areas, and one or two fairly, well, not that many strong Tory areas, right? The Isle of Wight and most of the other ones we've got here are either swing seats or Labour seats.
There's something I find quite interesting about the Isle of Wight being really pro-Leave. I wonder if it wants to be pro-independence as well after a while. I mean, Matt, you do a lot of work on this, don't you, in terms of looking at where the UKIP vote's concentrated and the Leave vote and that sort of thing. Are there any on this list that sort of stand out, bearing in mind people will be listening in as well?
Looking for tips.
Yeah.
No, these are the areas that I'd expect to be seeing. I mean, you've got your young university towns there for Remain. You've got Scotland, which is going to be a really strong Remain vote. Brighton and Hove. I mean, looking at that list, 5-1. I kind of fancy Oxford or Hackney on that list. Looking at the Leave side, on the other hand, there you can see, Tristram Hunt's constituency there, Stoke-on-Trent. He's going to have a difficult morning on the 24th, realising he's completely out of touch with his local constituents on the issue of Europe. And then you go down, Wolverhampton as well, Kingston upon Hull and Sunderland. I mean, Sunderland will possibly will it be one of the first to declare? I think.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the first one, yeah.
So and that would be a strong Leave vote. On that list, I mean, I would take Stoke, I think. I'd have a punt on Stoke.
Let's move ahead to the final week. Oh, sorry, Adam, you were going
Just
to
very quickly on Stoke, what I think is interesting because it goes back to the turnout point, is that obviously I believe that Stoke-on-Trent actually had the lowest turnout at the general election.
That's right, yeah.
So although it might be very Leavey, actually in a national election when every vote counts, again, perhaps Leave have the problem that much of their support is based in areas that traditionally just don't turn out to vote.
That could be a big problem for the Leave campaign in the final week, couldn't it? Actually getting these people to show up. I mean, let's move on to the sort of final week or so of the campaign. I mean, Matthew, I'll bring you back in. I mean, what has each side got to actually do? Well, obviously get their vote out and so on, but presumably there's a finely balanced campaign with strong arguments on both sides that at least seem to resonate. So what are you doing? Let's say take David Cameron in the first instance. What's he got to try and do to win this referendum?
Well, before the campaign even began, we've released the results of an experiment which looked at what was driving Remain support versus Leaves, and we found that making the positive case for the EU had the strongest predictor on an increased support for Remain. But Cameron and co have not done that. They've spent the entire campaign talking about the problems with Brexit. It's a bit like if you go and buy a new car, do you want to hear the great things about the new car, or do you want to hear what's crap about your old car? You probably want to hear about the new car. But Cameron hasn't done that. So I think he's really squandered the opportunity. So in the last week, Now, in a way, the polls might help him, because the polls may underline the urgency of the vote, the need for Remainers to turn out, and he may just need to focus on that message, get off the economic doom and gloom and say, listen, guys, this is about legacy, this is about your kids and your grandkids, you're going to have to turn out to vote. Leave, on the other hand, from everything I'm hearing, it's just keep the pedal down on immigration and Turkey, and looking at the data, good strategy.
What do you make of the Sun coming out for Leave? I mean, I found that really quite interesting, not because I think the Sun is going to shift opinions so much, but just the psychology of it. They don't seem to like to back the loser, and I found in the past when the Sun have been not quite sure what the vote's going to be, I can imagine Scotland, I think there's other votes in the past, then they sort of sit on the fence and say, it's up to you, and sort of take that cop-out, don't they? But they came out forcefully for Leave, and that feels like they must think that's going to happen.
Well, perhaps they got excited by the results of the polls last week, after the ORB showing Brexit 10 points ahead, perhaps that excited them. But I think also the Sun have invested so much in recent months in the anti-immigration, anti-free movement stuff. I think they kind of crossed the line at one point and said, we're committed to this, we're going to have to deliver on this. And this could be really significant. I mean, when we run an analysis of the Leave vote, reading Eurosceptic papers really is significant. So if the voters now are getting a nod from the Sun, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, possibly the Times. This stuff actually could make a difference in the final week.
We were talking earlier, Adam, weren't we, about how the comparisons with the Scottish referendum, for a long time it felt like they were following quite similar trajectories. I wonder whether that is one of the differences. With the Scottish referendum, the media was pretty much against independence with some exceptions, whereas it's almost the reverse with the Brexit vote, isn't it? I mean, what do you sort of make on that, but also what each side's got to do in the last week?
I think in terms of the comparisons between Scotland and the EU referendum, they can get a little bit overblown, as it were. I think particularly the key difference between them is in Scotland, rather than necessarily, obviously it did have the press behind the union vote, but like at the general election, on both cases, affluent voters and older voters were united behind the status quo, and together that saw them, tend to outperform the polls. This time, those two key blocks of voters aren't on the same page. You've got older voters on one side and affluent voters on another, and how they fall out will be key.
I mean, I suppose a lot's been said about what will happen if we remain and the pressure that might put on the Prime Minister if it's a close vote. But presumably, Matt, if people are going to start, dumping money on David Cameron to resign quite quickly, aren't they? If it's a Leave vote.
Well, yeah, from a purely cynical professional point of view, Leave would work out better, right? Because then we've got months of speculation, probably a Tory leadership contest, which people are already doing quite a bit of speculating about. Who knows, a Labour leadership contest if this doesn't work out right for the Labour Party either. And even the possibility of an early general election. Some people who generally know what they're doing have been backing the idea that we'll have an election this year or perhaps even next year.
I mean, Adam, I'll come back to you on this. The leadership question is quite interesting, isn't it? Because presumably David Cameron has to go there's some people that talk about caretaker leadership and that sort of thing, but he's toast if he loses, isn't he?
I think it's very interesting because he can't say that publicly because he doesn't want to turn it into a referendum on himself. So in terms of that obviously sort of what happens within the Tory party sort of slightly goes beyond even what the public want. There will obviously be a huge amount of pressure. I think at the beginning of the campaign, we were suggesting that Cameron was actually the biggest asset for the Remain campaign. He's pretty much the most trusted politician in the country, particularly that moderate Conservatives were the swing voters. There was obviously a proportion of sort of right-wing voters that always wanted to leave. Once Jeremy Corbyn publicly backed sort of Remain, that sort of most of the Labour vote, there was always a proportion that was that was out, but it was mostly on the inside, with those Conservative voters really being the key, the moderate Conservatives really being key, and he's got a very good record at being a very good salesman to them. Sort of his position over whether he has been sort of damaged over the course of the campaign. Yes, that could have more long-term impact.
Well, Cameron will have to go if we vote for Brexit. I think the only question is when he goes and whether senior Eurosceptics can convince him to hang on and perhaps oversee some of the initial negotiations or perhaps oversee the start of the Conservative succession. Matt just made a really interesting point, a point I don't think has got enough attention, which is what happens to Corbyn post-Brexit. Because a lot of the moderate Labour MPs, I imagine, will secretly, they might not admit to it, but secretly will be intrigued by the prospect of Brexit because it will open a door for them through which
They can say you didn't do
They
enough.
can say you didn't do enough to mobilise the Labour voters because your heart's not in it. You're not a proper Labour politician. And perhaps that will open the door for some kind of coup.
Certainly lots to keep an eye out for in the sort of upcoming week. I mean, Adam, have you got more polls coming out, or is that a state secret at this stage?
We do. We'll certainly have more in the run-up to the vote. I've got to take that one point up, though, because it was mentioned earlier, which was the herding.
Nearly let you get away with it. Go on. Not the herding.
That was, which was just, you obviously showed that chart at the beginning, and I can say that there's no, you know, the change we've seen in our last poll used, and the chart you showed exactly the same methodology. This is a genuine move that we are seeing. You know, can't speak for others, but no, we've absolutely kept the same methodology on that chart, as you can see, and it's just compressed in recent
Dan
weeks.
Hodges will be worth looking at on the morning after the referendum in terms of his perception of the polls, I'm sure. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. That's all we've got time for this week's Political Betting Polling Matters show. Certainly lots to digest as we look ahead to the final week of the EU referendum campaign. Join us next week. We'll be looking at what the polls are saying then and the potential impacts of a Brexit vote.